Okay, so saying that the Sentry dominates Thor is a bit of an understatement. He dominates everyone. It's nuts. This is Siege on Asgard, guys, a story that I don't think have ever covered on this channel. And it is the Sentry slash Void story. If you love the character, this is the story for you. So there is a lot of buildup that goes into this, but we'll talk about that as we go through the story to make it make sense. All this really kind of kicks off with Volstagg, a member of the Warriors 3, as most of you guys probably know from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. He's effectively goaded into facing off against some of Norman Osborn's henchmen, and that leads to a great big huge conflict between Volstagg and these guys at a stadium. And because of the massive nature of the calamity, the fact that Volstagg's not the sharpest tool in the shed, and the fact that so many people are killed, it leads Loki into getting Norman Osborn to act. Now, what's going on here? Okay, so this is the conclusion to a long-running publishing initiative for Marvel Comics that ran for like a few years called Dark Reign. We've never covered it. Yes, we should. I know you guys are going to ask us to. It was great. So the idea behind Dark Reign is that it really came out of Secret Invasion, right? That because Skrulls were secretly replacing superhumans, or really just people in general, and Tony Stark was director of S.H.I.E.L.D., he was kicked out as director because he didn't know what was going on. This was doubled down by the fact that Secret Invasion technically came to an end because Deadpool had sent information to Nick Fury, but that information was intercepted by Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin. When he got that information, he used it to end the war with the Skrulls. And so with Tony Stark ousted, Norman Osborn was put in his place as the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And when you put a bad guy in a position of power, he does what bad guys do. And that's what Norman Osborn did. He literally tore the entirety of S.H.I.E.L.D. down and then rebuilt it as an organization called Hammer. And then in turn, he created a kind of cabal that operated behind the scenes. Loki was a member of the cabal, but Loki's entire motivation was fairly simple, right? And that kind of goes into J. Michael Straczynski's run on Thor. Most of you guys have heard of Thor Ragnarok when Thor died. He comes back in Straczynski's run, and then he brings Asgard back, but restores it in Broxton, Oklahoma. And then after that, because all the Asgardians had been killed in Thor Disassembled and Ragnarok, he starts traveling around and waking up the spiritual essences of the various Asgardians. The first one he finds is Heimdall, because with Heimdall, he can find everybody else because Heimdall sees everything. And so what ended up happening is Loki kind of instigated a scenario where he revived the grandfather of Thor, a guy named Bor. And then Thor fought Bor and killed Bor. And the argument from Loki was, well, Thor killed the guy who was king because when Bor came back, it returns him to his rightful role as king. Therefore, Thor has to be ousted. That was kind of the first stage of his plan. The second stage was to basically instigate an event, which is this event here, Siege on Asgard, in order to basically force the Asgardians to leave Earth and travel back to the realm of Asgard because Loki believed Asgard should never be on Earth in the first place. And so all this came to a head in the here and now, because Osborn watching all of this is like, we have to do something, right? And so what he ends up doing is he tells his assistant Victoria Hand to basically assemble the full contingent of the Avengers as they operate under Osborn, as well as what's called the Initiative. Now, this is another part to kind of explain here. So as most of you guys know, Civil War, the Superhuman Registration Act, the bad guys won, right? You know, Tony Stark and Reed Richards and Hank Pym, all the people who were in support of superhuman registration, if that's the side you took. And that what ended up happening here is Captain America and most of the main Avengers as we know them went underground during the entirety of Civil War and became the Secret Avengers. Because there were no true Avengers left, they had either gone on to become part of Iron Man's Mighty Avengers, or they had joined Captain America, that what Norman Osborn did is he went to various villains and said, if you choose to join my new Avengers team called the Dark Avengers, I will basically vacate your prison sentences, right? Once your time is served, and then you can go out and do your own thing. Now, nobody knew they were the Dark Avengers. Everybody thought they were just the Avengers, but roles were shifted. Matt Gargan, also known as Scorpion, got the Venom symbiote, and he became kind of like the new Venom. Daken, the son of Wolverine, became the new Wolverine. Bullseye from the Daredevil mythos became the new Hawkeye. He was amazing in Dark Reign. I loved him in Dark Reign. It was so great. But so that's why you don't really get the true Avengers per se. But focusing on the story, right, in the here and now, that's just an important thing to understand here, that Norman Osborn actually enlists Ares, the god of war. Now, Ares, Hercules, Thor, they're all kind of like a trinity, essentially, in that while their power has waxed and waned over the years in Marvel Comics, if we kind of average it out, that they more or less are equal, depending on, who's writing the story and how the story is unfolding. But Ares is no slouch, and this guy is a hoss. And it's one of these things where when Norman Osborn tells him, we're going to war against Asgard, Ares is like, no, that's not going to happen. Like, number one, it's the Asgardians, right? I mean, sure, they seem pretty chill, but you're talking about a kingdom full of warriors. These people do nothing but fight, and you want to go to war with them? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And number two, these guys are my allies, right? They're my friends. I'm not going to go to war against my friends. But at the end of the day, he makes an incredibly compelling case. Norman Osborn does. Because what Osborn says is that Loki has taken control of Asgard, that is under the control of a madman, and that it shouldn't even be here in the first place. And that's where Ares kind of says, well, then it's a fight among mortal men. But the response of Osborn is, then why is Asgard here in the mortal world? And he's like, if we're not the ones to do it, then who will, right? And so it's somewhat of a convincing enough case, because then at that point you have Osborn, who goes to the basically Dark Avengers, and he's like, yeah, we're going to go to war against Asgard. And they have the same reaction as Ares, where they're like, are you crazy? Like, you want to go to war against a society of warriors, most all of whom are comparable to Thor in strength. They're all a little bit weaker, but they're way stronger than we are. And the response of Osborn is really just blackmail. He's like, okay, fine. If you guys want to go back to prison, that's cool. But if you guys do this for me, it's the last thing. Once we're done here, you guys go on, you guys do your thing, that's it. And so at that point, you switch over to Ares, who addresses the entirety of the 50-state initiative. Now, the 50-state initiative was a really cool idea that came out of Civil War. The comic was okay. It started off great, and then it kind of just sort of ran into the ground. But the idea behind it was that because the Superhuman Registration Act was an act that required superhumans to register, that what would end up happening is that the superhuman community would become a far more managed community. There was the 50-state initiative, which was a superhero team in all 50 states. I want to say it was the idea of Reed Richards, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But they would basically be trained, and they would operate in a way that was the most conducive to the state that they were in. And people who had powers would have powers that were most conducive to the states that they were in. So if you had a state that routinely dealt with wildfires, you would have members of the initiative that operated in that state that could combat wildfires, right? So people who could control cold, or who could manipulate the molecules around them to create water, right? Different things along those lines. But in this instance, they're all brought together. Now, it's not just the members of the 50-state initiative, it's the Dark Avengers and everyone under the control of Norman Osborn, including every former S.H.I.E.L.D. employee that now works as a Hammer agent. And so at that point, you switch to the President of the United States, where basically Victoria Hand calls up the president and is like, hey, so Norman Osborn is going to war against Asgard, and I don't know how you feel about it. And the president has the same reaction as everybody else. Are you crazy? Right? And at that point, because Norman Osborn, over the course of Dark Reign, had really operated in a way where he almost kind of existed above the law, really just sort of like, sure, S.H.I.E.L.D. is operating at the behest of the presidency, but Norman Osborn just kind of acts like he's doing his own thing. The president's had enough. And so at that point, they're monitoring everything. They're waiting to see how it plays out, because you're talking about forces with levels of power way beyond anything the military can cope with. But then you switch over to Loki. Now, here's the kicker behind all this. Loki told Norman Osborn that he was the one who was controlling Asgard and all that kind of stuff, that, basically Norman Osborn had come to believe that Loki was sort of losing his mind. None of that was ever true. Balder the Brave is the one who leads Asgard, right? He is the next in line as a son of Odin to rule over Asgard, because no one wants to see Loki do it, and Thor was cast out. But when Loki appears here, he tells Balder, they're coming for you. And he just totally spins a web of lies here, right? He's like, I tried to talk Norman Osborn down, but he's just hell-bent on doing it, man. And so you just need to like bring all the soldiers out, bring everybody together. And they all have to guard this place against the forces of Osborn. Here's the crazy thing that goes on here. Before they even get a chance to move, the whole building starts shaking and rattling because the Sentry is punching holes through it. Now, here's something that I need to point out here, right? This is the Sentry, but it's not the Sentry. It is not the Sentry as a superhero as we know it. It's the Void persona who's taken the body of the Sentry, right? So basically the bad guy's driving the car. Now, those of you guys who don't know about the Void in Marvel Comics, son, let me tell you something. You're going to see some crazy stuff. You're going to see some crazy stuff in this story because the Void is a hoss. Just to give you guys perspective here, right? When Brian Michael Bendis was writing New Avengers, and in the second story arc, right, which I think was called Who is the Sentry, there's a point where the Void manifests, and a full contingent of the Avengers at that point, the New Avengers, right? So the good guys, right? It's not Dark Avengers, but like the New Avengers, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four are helpless against this guy. There's nothing they can do to stop the Void. It all comes down to Emma Frost entering the mind of Robert Reynolds to fix everything. It's crazy how powerful the Void is. We actually have a video called, like, it's like a what if story, which is a what if based on this story, Siege, where like the Void kills the Marvel universe. He kills everybody and then like descends out into the universe, presumably destroying everything in creation and then probably destroying the universe itself. But like this just kind of heralds the arrival of all of Osborn's forces. And initially, when you have the Asgardians who come riding out on their horses and whatnot, Ares is there to meet them, right? He's there to greet them. And he's just kind of like, no, right? You guys need to stand down. While that happens and all of these, hammer jets are flying overhead, getting ready to attack Asgard, you've got Donald Blake, right? Because Thor went back to his Donald Blake persona and he's been tending to Tony Stark. It was this really crazy story in Invincible Iron Man Volume 2 where Tony Stark's mind was being moved around. Anyway, Norman Osborn beat the crap out of him, right? Beat him nearly to death. So like Iron Man is just kind of recovering under the care of Donald Blake. But as soon as he sees what's going on here, he immediately bolts out, grabs his stick, smacks it on the ground, turns into Thor. And he's like, the battle's on, son, because he comes racing in, right? This guy just comes flying in like a bat out of hell and like immediately shows up in front of Norman Osborn. But before he can do anything, the Sentry attacks him right off the bat and just like sends this guy crashing into the ground. And it's just like, it's done, right? I mean, like the Sentry's here. There's no way you can win, Thor, but it doesn't matter because even the powers of like Norman Osborn's inner guard, when they fire their abilities on Thor and release what is in effect an atomic blast, it doesn't matter, right? Thor's just like, you dare attack my home. But the crazy thing is this is all being broadcast to the world. Like the whole world is watching this news feed, including Captain America. And he stands up, right? He's just like, nope, this is not going to happen, right? No way we're going to let one of our guys just sit around and get smacked around like this to watch Asgard get attacked and do nothing. So Captain America starts to rally the Secret Avengers in order to bring them all into the battle. Now, at that point, you switch back over to Ares, and what's probably one of the craziest moments in this story when it came out. It was nuts, right? So Ares facing off against all these guys. He's operating under the idea that Loki runs everything. And that's what he's telling them, right? Like, you guys let a madman seize control of your lands. You let Loki run this whole thing. The reality is, you shouldn't have done that. And yes, I'm siding with Norman Osborn here, and I will kill all of you if I have to, unless you stand down. But then Heimdall appears. Now, Ares knows enough about Heimdall. He knows him incredibly well, but he knows enough about Heimdall to know that when Heimdall says, this is what's going on, his word is beyond contestation, right? This guy sees everything. And so Heimdall says, you are mistaken about what you've been told. Balder is the son of Odin. He's the king of Asgard, not Loki. You've been misled. And that's where Ares is just like, Osborn, right? This guy lied. He lied to me to goad me into a fight, to lead his armies against Asgard, right? And so at that point, you literally have like Osborn and his guys who are standing over Thor with the intention of doing him in. And then in that moment, like Maria Hill, right? The one who's kind of been keeping guard over Tony Stark. She comes riding in with like a bazooka and like fires this thing off at Osborne. It's not enough to do anything measurable. It just kind of offers a menial distraction, but they do grab Thor and they are able to throw Thor in the back of the truck and then try to drive him to safety. So at that point, you switch over to Captain America, right? Talking to all the secret Avengers here. You've got Miss Marvel back when she was a sex object. You got Luke Cage, Hawkeye, like Clint Barton, the real Hawkeye. Right, you've got Captain America at that point in time, which is Bucky Barnes. Kind of a little thing to fill in. This is after Captain America was believed to have been dead, right, during the death of Captain America's storyline. What ended up happening is I think he was time displaced, if I remember correctly, or something along those lines. And so Bucky Barnes ended up becoming the new Captain America in his stead. And then, of course, eventually Sam Wilson becomes Captain America after Bucky Barnes, and so on and so forth. But you've got like Wiccan, you've got Speed. One of the things that I do want to specify here, when it comes to Wiccan and Speed, specifically Wiccan, yes, he's incredibly capable, but he hasn't quite stepped into the full totality of his powers yet. So he's not like the guy who walks around the multiverse like he was in Young Avengers, whatever that story was, where he's just so absurdly powerful. He's like next to God in terms of the power he has. He's just some dude who can cast some hex spells and stuff like that. You also got like, Quake and so on and so forth. But with Nick Fury and all these guys in attendance, it's rallying them all together and saying, look, guys, we've hidden in the shadows long enough. We've spent enough time taking pot shots against Norman Osborn and his forces. It's time to get out there into the battle and bring this thing to an end once and for all. Well, then you switch back over, right? So like Norman Osborn and all their guys, and you have Ares launching his attack against Osborn based on the fact that Osborn lied. And at the end of the day, Osborn's like, I did whatever I had to do in order to get you into the battle, Ares. You would have done the exact same thing. And Ares is like, not against Asgard, not against my friends and family, not against my brothers. That's not going to happen. But I told you, right? I told you that if you lied to me, if you tricked me into coming out here under false pretenses, that I would tear you apart. Well, guess what, my friend? You owe me a debt, and I mean to collect. But in that moment, right, the Sentry comes swooping right back in and absolutely trashes Ares. And when I say trash this guy, I mean like, this dude never had a chance. It was never even close. And initially, Ares is like, I thought we were friends, but Ares doesn't know that it's the Void who's controlling the Sentry and not Robert Reynolds. And so like the Void just starts going on a warpath, absolutely crushing the Sentry every chance he gets. And as the fight goes on further and further, the Void kind of starts to lose himself, which is to say, holding on to the physical form of the Sentry becomes tougher and tougher to do. Not because of the fact that the Sentry's fighting back against him, just more to the fact that the Void is getting so caught up in his bloodlust, he's just not focusing on the right things. And that's when the Void is at his most dangerous. When he's like in the thick of battle and just letting it all out, dude, that's when the Void starts massacring everybody, right? That's when things go bonkers. And so literally there comes a point where Ares goes to launch on another attack against the Sentry, and the Sentry just grabs him. And everybody's watching this, and they're like, dude, is he really gonna do what I think he's gonna do? And the Sentry tears him in half from head to toe, just rips the God of War in two. And that's when everybody knows this battle is starting to get out of control, right? That there was no real intention of killing all the different superheroes. But when you're dealing with the Void, he doesn't care, right? It is irrelevant who lives and who dies. All he wants to do is inflict as much death and chaos as humanly possible. Now, at that point, you switch over to Daken, the son of Wolverine, who's masquerading as Wolverine. He was kind of sent on the hunt by Norman Osborn to find Thor because Daken basically has the same abilities that Wolverine does, right? Sense of smell and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, he's caught up to by Thor himself, right? Who literally just like smites this dude with some lightning and is like, look, man, I'm not running. Like, I appreciate you guys trying to save me. I appreciate you guys trying to get me to safety, but that's my home. Right? And I'm going to fight until I die in order to keep my home protected. Now, while all that's going on, you've got Norman Osborn who's talking to Taskmaster, and Taskmaster's like, hey man, you might want to turn around, because when that happens, this dude gets the business end of Captain America's shield. Dude, it is hilarious, right? He just gets like clocked over the face with this thing. So now the Avengers are full on into it. Now, while all this is going on, you do get a kind of a monologue of sorts between like the president and his joint chiefs of staff and that kind of stuff. And the president's like, I mean, what do we do in the middle of all this, right? And his joint chiefs are like, what can we do, man? It's like Civil War all over again. It's the superheroes fighting against the supervillains. And the reality here is, yes, you don't want Norman Osborn to be in control anymore. Captain America and Nick Fury, alongside Maria Hill, are leading the charge against Norman Osborn and his forces. Honestly, man, let's just see how it plays out, right? Let's just see how all this plays out. But in that moment, you have the Void, who makes his presence known on the battlefield again, because Thor shows back up, right? Like to the main battlefield itself. And the Sentry or the Void is just like, how many gods do I have to kill today? Which, by the way, is one of the hardest lines that I think I've ever heard in Marvel Comics, right? And like Thor goes to attack this guy and nothing happens, right? Like he hits him with every ounce of strength he has. And it like moves him a few feet. And so at that point, even on some level, Thor starts to realize he's kind of in over his head, right? And so then, of course, you basically kind of get this bit of a montage where you bounce back and forth between the various characters, Captain America and his guys facing off against Taskmaster. One of the funny things about this is there is a story where Captain America fights Taskmaster. He beats the crap out of Taskmaster. It's not even funny, right? Like Taskmaster gets the absolute tar. Like, dude, he gets he gets it handed to him by Captain America, is the way to put it. But again, Norman Osborn, ever the strategist, always has an ace up his sleeve. And so what he ends up doing is, in addition to the forces of the Initiative, as well as his Dark Avengers and all the agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., he brings in Parker Robbins. He brings in the Hood and all of the Hood's forces. So now it's like Madame Mask and all these guys who are just straight up villains. Are they enough to, overpower all the different superheroes? Not really. But at this point, it's starting to turn into a war of attrition, right? Just the superheroes facing off against overwhelming odds that they couldn't possibly hope to overcome. There's only one guy that can seemingly give them the saving grace they need. And it comes in the form of Speed carrying a briefcase as fast as he possibly can, because he's got the powers of Quicksilver, directly to Maria Hill. And initially she's just like, I don't know who you are, but put your hands in the air. And he's like, no, it's cool, right? I was sent by Captain America. I was told to give this to Tony Stark, right? And Tony Stark's like, bring it over here, man. This dude's limping, right? This dude's like barely able to get up, but it's literally his shield at that point. And so while all this is happening, you have the president who's looking at the entire scenario and is like, enough is enough, right? I'm giving the order, leave the ground battle to Captain America. That's fine, but take down Hammer. The order is given. Take down all of the Hammer helicarriers. So now it is Norman Osborn fighting the superheroes and the full might of the US military. The entire world has turned against him. But shifting back to the fight between Thor and Sentry, right? It's crazy. Thor says, you've chosen the wrong master and you've chosen the wrong battlefield. And for that, I must smite you down with all the power at my command. And the response of the Void, you're so adorable. You're A for effort, right? It was a great little speech, but at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything because there's nothing Thor can do. But before we get to that absolute demolishing that Thor is about to experience at the hands of the Void, when Thor learns to understand his place in the bigger picture, you do switch back to Osborn, right? And it is a kind of fight between himself and Captain America. But in the midst of this whole fight, right, where they're literally going toe to toe, and I wouldn't say Captain America's on the losing side, but he's certainly struggling to hold his own, suddenly Osborn's own armor starts to chime in. Shields down, interface corruption detected, database and power cell corruption detected. And that's where Osborn's like, what in the world is going on? Because truth to tell, all he did was repurpose existing Iron Man tech, but he doesn't know the ins and outs of Stark tech. He doesn't really know how it all works. And so this is Tony Stark back on the scene. Now, he is using an older suit of armor, but one of the things that Tony Stark had built into his suits, specifically after the events of Armor Wars with Justin Hammer, was the ability to basically hack into his own suits and override them if for some reason someone were to get their hands on them. That was one of the big significant things that came out of the original Armor War story. Up until that point, the idea of somebody stealing Stark tech and then taking his armors and using them against him, it was something that fans always kind of wondered, but it wasn't really anything that you saw in a meaningful way. Armor Wars completely changed that and turned it on its head. And that's where Stark says, I'm going to have this whole armor shut down here in a couple of seconds. So, do you have anything you want to say before Captain America pulls your head off? But it's all basically falling apart. And so Osborne does the only thing he can do, right? He says, Robert Reynolds, Sentry, do not let them win. Bring it down. Bring it all down. And that's where the Sentry is just like done. And he goes racing through and tears apart the entirety of Asgard, literally obliterates the entire castle, brings that whole thing crashing down. Now, the big kicker about this is that this leads to the suit being stripped away from Norman Osborn. And from the superhero's perspective, they're just kind of like, okay, cool. Like, we're basically winning here, right? Like, we're going to save the day. And Osborn is just like, you have no clue what you've done. One, because he's turning back into the Green Goblin again, but two, because he's like, you think you've done something here, right? You have no clue what you've done. Like, he's going to kill you all, right? He literally says, I was the only one who could stop him. I was the only one who knew what he really was, how powerful he was. I was saving you all from him. You don't know what you've done. And he's like, I was saving you. And that's where he just kind of points up in the sky. And with no one restraining the Sentry in any capacity, with no one for him to answer to, it allows the Void to fully manifest in his true form. And I gotta say, man, I always loved the way the Void looked in his real, true, unhindered form. He always looked absolutely amazing. And at that point, it's game over, son. It's on like Donkey Kong. Like, you have all the superheroes who just try to hold back as best they can, but none of it matters. Against a force of this nature, there's no way these guys are going to be able to take this dude out on their own. And I mean, everyone falls to the power of this guy. Carol Danvers, Thor, the whole nine yards. And so what ends up happening here is that because basically Parker Robbins and his guys had been magically enchanted using the Norn stones of Asgard, which, depending on who's wielding them and how well they can understand them, it'll basically grant people powers or amplify powers. Loki starts to realize how badly he screwed up, that Loki wanted Asgard to be removed from Earth. He wanted Asgard to be sent back to the dimension of Asgard, but he didn't realize what he had bargained for. He didn't realize that the Void was the one in control of the Sentry, not Robert Reynolds. And so this has gone way too far. And this is one of those moments where he's actually repentant for his actions. And so he summons all the Norn stones to himself and then takes the power of the stones and uses them to enchant all the other superheroes and to heighten their abilities to give them some fighting chance against the Void. And they do, right? Like, for a little bit, they hold their own. And when I say a little bit, I mean like a minute or two, because they are capable of like damaging him in various ways. Captain America can throw a shield, which can tear through the Void. But again, you're talking about a guy who has the ability to manipulate matter. So he just kind of like reconstitutes himself. Thor summons his lightning, he hits the Void with it, and the Void is kind of realizing your new powers. This is not some kind of a trick, is it? He's like, it's mischief. Mischief is what it is. And then he realizes Loki is the guy. So he immediately attacks Loki. And Loki tries to use the power of the Norns to overcome the power of the Void, but it's not enough. And at that point, the Void encases Loki and obliterates him, kills Loki on the spot. Now, this is an important thing, right? Because this is the story where Loki died, and then he was reborn as the younger kid that appeared in the Journey into Mystery Comics, for those of you guys who have always kind of been a little bit confused about the Loki mythos. But at that point, Thor watched his brother die. And the whole time this is going on, like, Norman Osborn is trying to bail out, right? He's trying to escape. Now, Captain America catches up to him, and the conversation is really interesting here, right? Because Captain America is like, how did you control him, right? How do you stop him? And the response of Osborn, I sympathized, right? Because what the Void wanted more than anything on Earth was for it to be a world without the Sentry and without Lindy. Lindy, of course, was the wife of Robert Reynolds, so she was the one that was always able to kind of bring him down. That was the main thing that Marvel had established ever since the Brian Michael Bendis Who is the Sentry story, when he was officially rolled into the main Marvel universe after the Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee story from the year 2000, right? The Sentry 6-part miniseries. And so because of that, Osborne agreed to give the Void that very thing. If the Void would ally with him, he would basically give the Void free reign to annihilate the Robert Reynolds persona and even Lindy herself. Now, in truth, it would have been almost impossible to do, but the Void is not a reasonable thing, right? The Void is a very emotional, hot-headed creature. I mean, after all, if emotions were logical, they wouldn't be called emotions. They would be called logicals. But the response here is that, like, Captain America asked, what is this guy? Or like, what is the Void? And the response of Norman Osborn, he's the angel of death. And so Captain America's like, dude, if you ever want to breathe fresh air again, you're going to tell me how to stop him. And that's where Osborn's like, you can't, right? He's the angel of death. There's nothing you can do. The best you can do is hope that you die quick. And that's it. That's the best you can hope for. And so Iron Man ends up seizing control of one of the Hammer helicarriers. And he like chimes in. He's like, is there anybody on this helicarrier at all? Anyone who can answer me. Now, Victoria Hand answers, and she's like, I'm here, and evacuation's underway. And the response of Iron Man is like, you got 10 seconds to get off that thing. And she's like, why? And he says like the most hard line I've ever heard. He was like, I'm turning it into a bullet, right? And so literally he takes this thing and just sends it careening down into Robert Reynolds, right? Into the Void. And it's enough to like totally defeat the Void to a degree and force Robert Reynolds to kind of convert back into his normal human form. Now, I know some of you guys are just like, what? Yes, bear with me here though, because it ain't over yet, right? Because at that point, all the superheroes gather around him. And one of the things to keep in mind, when it comes to Robert Reynolds, it's very much a kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, old school Bruce Banner, Incredible Hulk thing, right? Like Bruce Banner turns into the Hulk and he doesn't know what the Hulk does. Hulk turns into Banner and he doesn't know what Banner does, right? And so Robert Reynolds doesn't necessarily know what the Sentry or the Void do when they're the ones who were in control. And so that's why when he gets up, he was just like, did I do this? Right? And that's where Iron Man's like, yes. And so he asks the same thing that he always asks, right? Will you please kill me and end my suffering? And the response of Thor is no. And literally Bob is like, please do this. And Thor says, you will live to pay for your crimes, Robert Reynolds. You will live to see penance for the death of my brother, for the fall of my home, for the betrayal of all that the Avengers stand for. And that's where literally Robert Reynolds, his eyes just start turning red again. And he's like, you're not listening to me. And immediately he turns back into the Void, right? And like at that moment, Thor does the only thing he can do, right? He literally says, okay, it's Robert Reynolds starting to manifest the Void. Now, one of the things to know in Marvel Comics, you have a very short window between the time that Robert Reynolds starts to manifest into the Void and when the Void fully reemerges. If you can catch him right in that small window, you can defeat him, you can overpower him. And that's exactly what Thor does here. He literally uses the full might of his power, the God Blast, basically, and like hits Robert Reynolds with it. And it's enough to annihilate him on the spot. Thor literally performs a mercy killing on Robert Reynolds. And the way that Marvel demonstrates that is that the Sentry Tower, which sits over top of Avengers Tower, literally starts to fade away. It was a kind of manifestation of the Sentry's abilities. Because the Sentry had the ability to alter reality in the same way that the Void did, not on a super high level, right? He wasn't like Franklin Richards or anything like that, but because he had the ability to manipulate matter, he manufactured, kind of created Sentry Tower at the top of Avengers Tower. With it being gone, Thor just takes the body of Robert Reynolds and almost kind of unceremoniously tosses it into the sun. And then from that moment, he comes back to Earth. And the battle's effectively over at that point. Right? Like all the different, supervillains are arrested and so on and so forth. Everything kind of starts to wind down. Captain America becomes the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. And this story taking place in 2010 kind of starts to segue a little bit into Jonathan Hickman's run on Avengers: The New Avengers, where Captain America eventually returns as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. during the events of Time Runs Out. Of course, the Superhuman Registration Act is completely repealed, right? All that kind of stuff. And it basically led into what we as fans of Marvel Comics call the heroic age. It was a whole new branding initiative, right? Where we had gotten out of like this 10-year era. But I will say this, man, that 10-year period, right? Not even really 10 years per se, but more like 2004 to 2010. So about a 6-year window when Joe Quesada was editor in chief, starting with like Brand New Day. I don't care what Spider-Man fans say. Get over it. It happened like 20 years ago. During that whole era, it was phenomenal. It was some of the best storytelling in Marvel ever. Like, it was incredible the kind of stories that were coming out of Marvel Comics at that point in time. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.